So why in the world would anybody choose January 1st to be the first day of the year? Would it surprise you to know that that wasn't always the case? Next on A Moment More. So I am sitting outside. The rain has finally stopped here on New Year's Day, the first day of the year, just wondering why in the world is this the start of all new things? And as I look around, I can't switch it around. Dope. As I look around, you just wonder, why would we celebrate a new year midwinter? And so if you were at Mass this week and you got a piece of this basically in the homily, but would you be surprised to know that it wasn't always the case? The earliest records that we have of written things, of when people celebrated the new year, it was, from the 2000s BC in Mesopotamia, where the first day of the new year, but it was celebrated close to the spring equinox. For us, I think this year in 2021, it's like March 20th or something like that. But it was celebrated, ice is melting, birds are flying, things are blooming, I'm sneezing all over the place for pollen. It's this new idea, new birth. It's a giving. We see it all over creation. So why is it that somehow it gets put at January 1st? Well, even in Rome, back in those times, Rome celebrated early as well. They celebrated in March. Think of even our months that we still have from them now. September, October, November, December, 7, 8, 9, 10. Those aren't the 7th, 8th, and 9th, and 10th months from January. They're from March. They're from the beginning when they would have celebrated the beginning of the year. But in the year 153, an edict goes out in Rome, and for many different reasons, 2 months are added, January and February, and the day of the year, the New Year's Day, is moved to January 1st. So that's where that begins in that time period for different reasons. Now, they say popularly it was still celebrated in March, but for civic reasons and different places like that, it was there at January 1st. But on the Christian Jewish side, there were certain reasons too. The Jews had this thing where they believed that the greatest of men would be conceived and die on the same day. And we celebrate the Annunciation, the conception of our Lord, on March 25th. And interestingly enough, the date that we put for the crucifixion in the year that he died is March 25th as well. So even for us, this beginning of new things, these great new beginnings of freedom, even in the theological, spiritual realm, harmonize with creation in that time. It goes so far, even in the year 567, a council is called at Tours, and they actually abolish January 1st, and they kick it all out to March. And so Lady Day, the day of celebrating the Blessed Mother, and the day of Christ's conception, and the spring, and all these things converge, and they're all celebrated in that time. So even the church begins, and so it was for 1,000 years. And it's true, for 1,000 years, that is the way things go. And I was laughing, somebody at Mass actually picked out the date, because I mentioned Lord of the Rings. Even in Lord of the Rings, the date that Tolkien chooses for the destruction of the ring is March 25th. That is the day of new freedom and peace throughout the realm. Anyway, I digress. So we jump to 1582, not in Middle Earth, not in the year 3019 of Middle Earth, but for us, in 1582, a new calendar is formed, because the days were slipping. They didn't have leap years. They didn't have, the extra days built in, things like that. So at one point they realized, I think it was 11 days off. And so imagine, I think they chose, I was told, a teacher told me this after Mass, they said, listen, it was actually October 4th, and they made a decree that it went from October 4th, and the next day was October 15th in 1582. Now this calendar is known as the Gregorian calendar for Pope Gregory, who was named after it. Another thing, interestingly enough, the Protestants at that time, they actually protested that as well, because it wasn't something that was to be accepted, and you can understand that, the nations at the time. But the British, for example, didn't even accept the calendar until 1752. So imagine, even here in the British colonies, here in America, the American colonies, all these areas, the New Year's was celebrated in different times, like even then in March. The Greeks, for example, wouldn't accept it until the early 20th century. Some things that were going on there in the early 20th century. So there's a change over time with this New Year's Day. It hasn't always been as we celebrate it now, midwinter. Finally, here in the 1960s, there was final church reform to the state of affairs where we're at now. And, January 1st, it's the 8th day. It's the final day in the octave. So it begins with the Nativity of Christ, and it ends with his naming and with his circumcision on what is now January 1st. And we have Mary, the Mother of God, on this day, tipping the hat once again to the Blessed Mother. So here we are. This is the way we celebrate it nowadays. In 1,000 years, who knows what New Year's Day will be. But we're here in this cold, rainy, and a lot of the places snowy beginning of the year, wishing that it was 1,000 years ago when we could celebrate when it's warm. But it is what it is, and I hope you enjoyed a little bit of the history of that. There's all kinds of cool things in it, but hopefully you got something from it. All right, we'll see you next time on A Moment More.